So with that dual mass flywheel off the car, I had to find something else to use in its place because some of those parts were trashed. So I did order a brand new one, but I also got this used setup that I had kicking around. Now this one was pretty new, with the only problem being that it sat outside for a little bit and got kind of rusty, so I had to hit it with a wire wheel and get it cleaned up. But you can see it's a self-adjusting pressure plate and it's a good brand. And just having a look at it here, after cleaning it up with the wire wheel, you can see that that surface is actually pretty good. You can actually see the original like machining marks that are still in it. Now there are some, you know, little potholes from rust there, but I think once it wears in, it's going to look pretty good, and it'll definitely do the job. Now the disc, I'm going to reuse the one that was actually in the car when it had that dual mass failure, because it's actually practically brand new, and I'm going to use this flywheel. Now the reason I'm going to use this instead of the brand new one that I ordered is, well, first of all, I have another project that's going to need a dual mass flywheel, so I'm going to need to keep one or the other for it. And when I got the brand new one here, because I wasn't originally going to use this one, because you can see in the mechanism here, there's like about this much play. It's a few degrees, and I kind of thought that the dual mass were tighter than this when they were new, but the brand new one that I got had exactly the same amount of play in it. So I think that this one was pretty new when it was removed. Now unfortunately, like I say, it sat outside and got a little bit rusty. I've popped the pilot bearing out of it because I want to replace that with a new pilot bearing, just to be on the safe side. But I think this is going to do the job. It's definitely going to hold as much power as this 3 liter is going to make.
So you're going to want to put your new pilot bearing in the middle of your flywheel, and then I used the old pilot bearing as just something to tap it down. You can use a socket or something like that as well. Next, we're going to put the flywheel onto the motor, and at this point, you know, you put a little bit of Loctite on your bolts, and then just hold your flywheel up by hand and feed those bolts in and get them as tight as you can. You want the flywheel to be sitting square on the crank, the end of the crank, and get your bolts just finger tight, and then you're going to want to lock the crank. So at this point I needed to lock the crank in order to torque the flywheel bolts down. Now I thought that it would be the same crank locking tool as a 2.7, but when I got in there and took the plug out of the side of the block to put the tool in, I realized that the threads in the block are totally different. So what I did was I found a bolt that was the same thread as the plug that I took out in the block, and I just machined the tip of that bolt down so that it would slide into the crank, into the little locking hole that's in the crank, the same way that the 2.7 tool did. So the motors are very similar, and in fact the 3 liter and 2.7 cranks are interchangeable. But what I decided to do was I just made the bolt, the snub on the bolt, the same sort of length and the same shape as the 2.7 locking tool, and then the only difference at that point is the type of thread. So luckily I had a bolt with the right thread, threw it in the lathe, machined it down, and that tool did the job. So to use the crank locking tool, what I did was I took the plug out of the side of the block, and then I turned the crank over by hand until the little hole that's in one of the counterweights in the crank lines up with the hole in the side of the block, and then just put the tool in the side of the block and screw it in by hand until it bottoms out, and then just tighten it down with a wrench to lock the crank properly. So once you have your crank locked down and you come in to torque your flywheel bolts, the information I found said 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So the first step was to come in with my torque wrench and, working in a star pattern, tighten all the bolts down to 60 Newton meters. I did a couple of steps. So I did, 40 Newton meters at first, and then I went back around and did 60 Newton meters just to get them all in the right window and make sure that the crank was flat, or that the flywheel actually was flat against the crank. Once all those bolts are torqued down, I actually come in with a Sharpie and I marked off the center of all the bolts. So basically I put a mark on each bolt facing the crankshaft, and that helps me to then orient my bolts when I do my extra 90 degrees. So the next step is to put your clutch disc back on and your pressure plate. Now I put the pressure plate on and feed the bolts in by hand and just get them so that the pressure plate is loose enough that the clutch disc can still be moved by hand, but tight enough that it doesn't fall to the bottom as soon as you let go of it. And that allows you to, take your time and make sure that it's centered in the pressure plate and in the flywheel. So at that point, feed your bolts in by hand, center your disc. Now ideally you want to use a clutch alignment tool, but I don't have one, so I just kind of eyeballed it. I've done that a lot of times in the past and never really had an issue, but if you want to be absolutely sure, and if you're working with the motor in the car, it's probably better to have the clutch alignment tool, because with the motor in the car you can't really get your head behind to be able to see that the clutch disc is centered. And if it isn't centered when you go to put the transmission in, you can really force a lot of things and end up with some damage. So you want to make sure that it's centered, and then go around and tighten your pressure plate bolts. I did 20 Newton meters and then 90 degrees of rotation. And the last thing to do to get your transmission back on is to physically install your transmission. What I did was lift the motor up a little bit with my cherry picker here, and then I sat the transmission on one of its little legs. Ideally you want the two to be sitting pretty flat, and then as you bring the transmission in, you might have to change that alignment a little bit, because once you get your input shaft centered in your clutch disc, you might realize, oh, okay, the top of my bell housing is really close to the block and the bottom of the bell housing is quite far away. So maybe you pick up the motor a little bit more so that it's even. And then what I like to do is just start to, when I get it close enough that I can start to put the bolts in by hand, I'll just put in whatever bolts I can. And that's an easy way to tell how your alignment is if you're having a hard time seeing it, because if your bolts are engaging the threads on the top and you can't reach at the bottom, you know that you need to pick that motor up and transmission up a little bit, close up the gap at the bottom, and maybe open up the gap a bit at the top. And then basically from there, I feed the bolts in by hand. I don't use a tool to tighten those bolts down to like try and draw the transmission in, because if you have to force those bolts, there's a good chance that your transmission isn't lined up properly, or it's hanging up on something, or maybe your throat bearing is not sitting on the shaft properly and it's interfering with the pressure plate. There's a lot of things that can go kind of weird at this stage. So if the transmission isn't going in smoothly, and by smoothly I mean smooth enough that you can sort of put the bell housing bolts in by hand, then you might have an issue that you need to figure out before you try and draw it in. So ideally, if you're feeding those bolts in by hand, what you're going to find is that you can tighten if a couple of the bolts up, maybe at the top of the bell housing, and then you might have to lift the transmission sort of at the bottom of the bell housing in order to get those bottom bolts to reach or to loosen up a little bit. And just by wiggling the transmission and kind of feeling around all the different bolts in the bell housing, when you go to tighten those up, you'll end up just finding one that's a little bit loose. You put a couple of turns into it, wiggle things around, find another one that's loose, put a couple turns into it, and you kind of just walk the transmission in like that. And if you're doing that by hand and you can walk the transmission in until it's just about touching the block, or even until it's fully engaged with the block, you know that everything should be pretty good inside there, that everything's lined up properly, and then you've drawn everything in properly. And there we have it. We've got the transmission installed back onto the motor. Everything went together really nice, and I think that everything's going to work great.